Hello, I'm 200 students. This is the fourth of my videos about the transition from classical to medieval period. This one is about the rise of Islam and how it overthrows the control of Rome in Egypt and Syria and parts of what's now Turkey, spreads across North Africa, conquers the Persian Empire, and creates this massive new power, the Caliphate, which really shapes the history of the next, several hundred years. And, one of the big things that distinguishes the classical period from the medieval period is the destruction of Roman power. But another one is the central role of religion in the medieval period. And a big part of that is the emergence of this new religion of Islam, where Islam plays this incredibly important role, kind of knitting together the whole Eurasian continent together with Africa, creating this enormous sort of shared culture that means that people can travel from sort of one end of the world to the other and still, speak the same language, worship in the same way, expect the same laws, right? It's really important. And, we're going to be tracing the effect of Islam on Western culture in a lot of different ways going forward. And it's going to be the focus of many sort of subsequent videos. So this is really just the beginning of a story that is going to occupy us for quite a while. But the first step in this is talking a little bit about the emergence of Islam and its sort of first geopolitical actions and the role that it plays in ending the hegemony of Rome in the eastern part of what used to be the Roman Empire. Okay, so first, a little bit of background. The Roman Empire had kind of a resurgence to some degree in the 6th and early 7th centuries. So the most famous emperor of this period is Justinian, and you can see that this map really shows Justinian's empire, right? And you can see that it expanded, right? So the dark green is what it looked like when he took the throne, and that's more or less corresponds to the traditional Eastern Roman Empire, distinct from the Western Empire. And you can see that he reconquered actually a good bit of the Western Empire, right? So he reconquered North Africa. He finally wipes out the Vandals and retakes those, what had been those rich Roman provinces. He conquers Italy. I mean, I shouldn't say he uses his generals Belisarius and Narses. He's at home in Constantinople. But, his armies, his empire reconquer these places. But those conquests didn't really last. North Africa lasts for a while, but Italy doesn't so much, and southern Spain doesn't so much. But nevertheless, the Roman Empire still existed. They called themselves Romans. One big shift that does happen here is that the eastern part of the Roman Empire had always spoken Greek in preference to Latin. Latin was used in places, but Greek was the common language of the people, and it had been adopted by their rulers as well. So Rome, at its height, really was a kind of a bilingual empire. And the parts of the empire that spoke Latin were also the ones that stopped being Roman. And so by the 6th century, the Roman Empire was already kind of different because it was a Greek empire. And this influenced the kind of disconnect from the western part because people stopped being bilingual so much, right? There wasn't this kind of class of educated people who spoke both languages anymore so much. But despite that, it's shrunk in size, and its change in culture that was connected to its loss of the Western Latin-speaking parts of it, it was still, the most powerful empire in the vicinity. Mostly. It was still hostile to and rival with the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east. And at the beginning of the 6th century, there was a really nasty series of wars between the Sassanids and the Romans based out of Constantinople. And this was really kind of as close as the Sassanid Persians ever came to just winning the war against the Romans and conquering them, right? So the Sassanids had armies besieging Constantinople and had, broken through the outer fortifications and really had the Romans on the run for quite a while. But the Romans brought over a new emperor. They deposed the old one because he was not doing a great job, and they brought over a general from North Africa, actually, named Heraclius, and he became the new emperor. And he was incredibly successful. He did this very sort of creative military thing where he just left the Constantinople under siege and took an army and landed it east along the southern coast of the Black Sea and attacked the Persians basically from behind. So that the Persian emperor was sitting there, besieging Constantinople. I don't know if he was there personally, but his army certainly were. When all of a sudden he finds out that there's this enormous army running around in his home territory. And eventually this culminated with Heraclius pretty comprehensively defeating the Persians and signing a new peace treaty. Okay? And so saving the empire and restoring more or less the old borders beforehand. But both empires, this sort of standard take on this, had been quite exhausted. This had been a long, long war. It had gone on for years and years. And there'd been, it had spread across both empires, the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and had, with war comes devastation, right? These armies are huge and they eat everything that's theirs, and so they spread famine in their wake and disease, because disease tends to go along with these armies, and of course they kill a lot of people too, ravaging and burning cities and all this kind of thing, right? So warfare leads to enormous destruction and loss of life, and that had been the situation. And at just the same time when this war was ending, a new power was emerging. And this was the Arabs under their new prophet, Muhammad. Okay? So let's move to discussing Muhammad for a little bit. And I'm not going to give the whole story here, right? This is a topic that is very interesting, and you could spend a whole history lecture just on the details of Muhammad's life. But the details of his life aren't as important to us as the religion that he creates. So I'm just going to kind of mostly focus on Arab culture and the sort of important new things that Muhammad brings with his revelation. So Arabia was an area that was familiar to both the Persians and the Romans, but was outside of both of their control. And this was mostly because of the terrain and the climate, right? So it's very hot, and a lot of it is desert. But Arabia was divided into two parts. The Romans called it Arabia Deserta, which basically means like wasteland, and of course our word desert comes from that. And then Arabia Felix, fortunate Arabia, right? The part of Arabia where the climate is suitable for agriculture, right? Not like agriculture like they practice it in the fields of France or anything, but you can grow a variety of things that tolerate the relatively warm climate where there's more water. Okay, so Arabia Felix. And so there was a similar split in Arab culture. There was the culture of those who lived in the drier parts, right? Not sort of out in the full-on sand dune desert typically, but in the drier areas at the edge of it, and even into it in some places where there were oases or places where you could herd animals, because that's how those nomads survived. They're usually called Bedouins, right? That's the term for the nomadic Arabs, and they lived as nomadic pastoralists, right? So somewhat similar to the Huns in their lifestyle, although adapted to a completely different climate and to different animals as well, right? So they herded goats and camels and horses and sometimes some other things, not pigs, not cattle usually, right? And those herds were the source of their livelihood, right? The Bedouins. So they used them for meat and for milk and for hides, and they used those as the basis for their trade with the settled agriculturalists who lived on the boundaries of the territory that they claimed for their own, right? And those settled people were to the north of Arabia, they were the Romans and the Persians, and to the west and south of Arabia Deserta, they were other Arabs, right? And those other Arabs lived in towns and cities. And two of those were what we now call Mecca and Medina, okay? So both of those were cities that, engaged in agriculture, but had a lot of their economies based on trade. So extending back for hundreds of years at this point, there had been trade routes that ran across Eurasia, right? From the Mediterranean and the various areas that are connected to the Mediterranean, across Arabia or across Syria and Mesopotamia to the north, or even further north, across like the Caucasus, and then into India and ultimately China. Okay, so Rome actually traded with China during the height of its power, right? Not directly, it was a series of intermediaries, but the Romans traded for silk and crystal from further east, and even there was a little silk trade that got set up in Constantinople in the Eastern Roman Empire that was by monks who had stolen some of the silkworms and learned how to keep them alive and brought them back to Constantinople. So in the settled parts, the sedentary parts of Arabia, there were these towns that were engaged in trade and in agriculture and were linguistically and ethnically united with the Bedouins who lived in the more desert areas, but also had their own culture and tribes. And part of the culture was that it was tribal. Okay, so people knew the overall big clan that they were a part of, and then the specific tribe within that clan that they were a part of, and those served as kind of unifying things. So basically, particularly in times of danger, the people that you would call on were first your close relatives, and then the members of your tribe, and ultimately maybe your clan. Because this was not a culture that had much in the way of written law or even really written culture. It was primarily oral, not exclusively. They had they had writing, and they used it. But a lot of the culture, particularly the Bedouin culture, was like oral, and they had epics and poems that they recited, and oral poetry was a big thing that was held in high regard. And so there were these two groups of Arabs that had a lot of connections, including family connections and cultural connections, but which also had very different lifestyles. And they certainly weren't unified as Arabs particularly, right? They spoke the same language or dialects of the same language, but they were enemies among each other as much as anything else. Okay, so the city of Mecca was where Muhammad was from, and it was important not just because it was on the trade routes, although it was, and Muhammad himself earned a living as a merchant when he was younger, but also because it was seen to be a holy place already. What it had the Kaaba, which was a holy shrine which was centered around a black piece of rock, which was, sort of seemed to be special. It's like meteoric in its origin, but inside of this holy place, there were idols to all of these different gods. Okay, and these were sort of the traditional Arabic gods, and not even necessarily just Arabic gods, right? It was a holy place that was the center of a lot of worship, and it was a gathering place for religious ceremonies, and this was one of the things that made Mecca important at the time. And so one of the things that Muhammad did when he eventually came to power was he destroyed all of the other idols, all of the idols, right? All that was left was the black piece of rock itself. And that was sort of, one of those symbolic beginnings of Islam, this commitment to monotheism, the insistence that there's only the worship of Allah, and anything that smacks of idolatry, worshipping an image or a statue or anything else like that, is forbidden. Okay, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here because we haven't talked really about the steps leading up to that. So Muhammad was an orphan from a young age, and so because of that, he was sort of taken care of by his tribe. He married an older widow when he was quite young, and she sort of was his a big support for him and became quite important in the early history of Islam. And and so this relationship with Khadija, which was her name, was 25 years long. She died 25 years after their marriage, and she was like one of his very first supports. So he didn't begin preaching until much later, right? So there was a period where he was just, he was married. He was engaging in trade along with his family, representing his wife's interests and the interests of his family and making money. And before he engaged in his religious career, he already, we're told, had a reputation for honesty and intelligence. He was making a positive impression on people. But he also developed a habit of going off by himself for a while. On a yearly basis, he would go up outside of the city and kind of like isolate himself from others. And it was when he was doing that one year, when he was 30th, that he received his first visitation. So the tradition is, and what Muhammad believed, was that this is a visitation from an angel, the angel Gabriel, the messenger of God. He didn't see anything, but he heard a voice that told him to recite, and he didn't know what. But eventually, Muhammad began to preach what the revelation that he was receiving from the angel, and this led to him becoming a religious figure in his community, right? And what he preached was monotheism and living virtue, putting aside selfishness and lies, and eventually all of the doctrines that have become the modern religion of Islam. So the path that Muhammad walked was not a smooth one. He developed enemies inside of Mecca who opposed him both for the novelty of his religion and for the usual sorts of reasons that powerful people don't like being sort of told what to do, and to avoid sin and so forth, right? He preached against wickedness and corruption that he saw around him, and the people he was calling wicked and corrupt didn't appreciate it. And so he was forced to flee from Mecca to the city of Medina. And he was invited to go there. So things were getting dangerous for him in Mecca, and he was offered a new place. And this was because in Medina there was strife locally, and actually historically not uncommon way of dealing with local strife between factions is to try to invite an outsider who has a good reputation to try and resolve the strife, right? The basic issue is that if you have, everyone is kind of like part of one faction and all the factions are enemies with one another in a city, there's no one that you can find who's from that city that everyone will agree on who might be fair, right? If someone is from one faction, then the other factions won't trust him, right? So a way to resolve that is to bring in someone who's no connection to anybody, who has a reputation as being honest and truthful is redundant, but virtuous, upright, will judge things justly, right, and is educated and smart, so he can solve problems, and putting power in their hands so that they can resolve things, right, and settle things without resorting to violence. And so that's what happened. He was brought in as a judge and ruler ultimately in Medina, and eventually that led to conflict with Mecca. Not directly that, but conflict with Mecca emerged, and he was ultimately triumphant in that conflict, right? He conquered Mecca despite, at many points, overwhelming odds against the Muslims and the Medinans. And when he reestablished himself in Mecca, he lived for only a few more years after that, but it kicked off a process of very rapid spread of his new religion and acceptance of him as a prophet inside of the Arabic world. And of course, when he returned to Mecca is when he destroyed all of the idols inside of the Kaaba to institute this new iconoclastic monotheism. So on this map, the red part, right, is the spread of Islam under Muhammad. And the tradition that we have, which seems to be basically accurate, is that under Muhammad, the religion spread among Arabs, but not really particularly outside it. Okay, and it spread partly through just voluntary conversion and partly through the non-Muslim Arabs fighting against the Muslim Arabs and losing, and so then replacing their leaders and converting. Okay, so after the death of Muhammad, there was what that map calls the patriarchal caliphate. It's also called the Rashidun Caliphate by some, which means rightly guided. And the Rashidun Caliphate was the period where the leader of the Muslims, right, the leader of the people who are obedient to Allah, right, was decided in a kind of a democratic process, right? So not like a vote by all Muslims or anything like that, but by the closest associates of the Prophet choosing who would be the next best leader, right? So the key point being, it wasn't early on a hereditary thing. Okay, the Prophet had children and had a son, but the first caliph, the first successor to Muhammad, was not his son. So this period sees a lot of really interesting things happen. But one of those is that Arab armies, Muslim Arab armies, spread out of Arabia and conquer Persia and conquer big chunks of what had been the Roman Empire. All right? So Egypt in particular, Syria, and Persia. And part of this is because, or at least it's usually thought to be because, as we said earlier, the Romans and the Persians had just been fighting each other to death and were exhausted and had kind of worn each other out. But part of it was the the excellent leadership and the incredible motivation of the Muslim armies, right? One of the things that we find, right, over and over again in history is that pastoral nomads are very dangerous to their settled rivals and can conquer them and install themselves as rulers if they can actually unify themselves. Okay, so probably the two most famous examples that we have of many, but like the two biggest ones of pastoral nomads that had been very disunited and spread out into a whole lot of different groups and then bring themselves into one big force under a single leader that then goes out to conquer a whole lot of things. One is this one, right? The emergence of Muslim Arabia and its unified, sort of centralized, semi-centralized authority under the caliphs, and it's a massive, rapid expansion. The other big one, which we'll talk about later in the course, probably, is Genghis Khan, right? And there was a single leader, Temujin, who unifies not just Mongols but other pastoral nomads under his authority, and he himself leads these big waves of conquest that continue for a while after his death under his sons and grandsons. So part of the story is, of course, just that by unifying all of the Arabs under the single faith that told them that they were brothers, effectively, right, part of the same community, and that they shouldn't fight one another, and that they should obey the successor of the prophet, this unified a large group of people who had previously been their own worst enemies, literally. And so they were able to put large unified armies into the fields. But it wasn't just that, because these armies also defeated often much larger armies in the field. Part of it was also, in the case of the Muslim conquest, probably the effect of the religion itself, right? Stimulating the Muslims to a kind of belief in the afterlife and the rewards of the struggle, and so leading them to be very effective warriors because they were not afraid of death. So I'm not going to talk right now about the idea of jihad too much. The short thing that I want to say is just that it's not really clear if even what was going on here they would have called jihad at the time. What is clear is that part of early Muslim culture was the idea that the faithful ought to spread the political control of the caliph by war, if necessary. Okay, and it wasn't that they should convert the members of other religions by force. Okay? One of the very interesting and important things about Islam at almost all times and places is that it doesn't force people to convert to Islam, and there's no problem with living under a Muslim rulership and sort of practicing your own religion with certain restrictions. But this is compatible with the idea that although people shouldn't be forced to convert to Islam, that areas that are not under Muslim rulership should be put under Muslim rulership, right? That part of the divine plan is that the authority of Muslim rule should spread everywhere, right? And sort of in the early days, it was widely believed in the Muslim community that this was something that was foreordained by God, that the Caliphate would inevitably and rapidly spread across the whole world. And for quite a while, it looked as if that was exactly what was happening, and that was exactly God's plan, right? The speed at which the Caliphate spread was quite incredible, and it had amazing victories and very few setbacks for a very long time, right? So even after the defeat of Persia and the repeated defeats of the Romans, that wasn't it, right? The Caliphate continued to spread east and west and became, one of the largest empires in history. The concept of the Caliphate itself was that Muhammad had concentrated both religious authority and temporal authority, that is like sort of authority over everyday law and government, in his own hands, right? Part of the revelation that he provided was revelation about the right way of organizing life, right? Both in terms of things to do on a daily basis, but also in terms of laws, right? There was a fair amount of detail that Muhammad gave about how the laws in society should be set up. Okay? And this is a big contrast to the previous main prophet in the Abrahamic tradition, Jesus, right? Jesus has a lot to say about sin and about how to live, but Jesus doesn't really give a legal code or anything resembling one, right? Islam is very different in that regard. And so the role of the caliph was seen as being, the representative of the whole Muslim community and speaking on behalf of it and making decisions for it. And this involved both religious and political decisions. But pretty soon, it became clear that the real day-to-day focus of the caliphate was on the political and military side, right? So the source of the caliph's authority was his religious status as the successor of Muhammad. But the main role of the caliph was not primarily religious, right? It was more what we would see as being, military, governmental, administrative, and legal. And however, to sort of walk that back a little bit, right? The distinction between what is religious and what is legal in the context of the caliphate is not firm at all, because law is based on what the prophet has said, and so legal rulings are in a certain sense religious rulings, right? And professional lawyers and judges are people who are trained in the Quran and the Hadith, people who are religiously trained. You can't really function in the caliphate in a legal capacity without going back to what are ultimately religious revelations. I mean, a lot more builds up on top of that, but that's sort of the way in which the sort of religious role of the caliph ends up being sort of brought forward, that the caliph is the sort of ultimate source of and guarantor of the proper exercise of law, right? Because law is the sort of the practical embodiment of religion in the sort of way that it sort of interacts in a day-to-day way with people, that there might be sort of disagreements, or there might need to be some sort of judgment that's rendered. Okay, so the caliph has this religious authority, but it's this political authority as well. And over time, the religious authority becomes less important, because what grows up is a religious and jurisprudential group of educated people, the ulema, who are the sort of practical interpreters of law and practical interpreters of the Quran, and answer people's questions about these things. And there's really sort of no direct involvement of the caliph in that. And this development of the ulema is one of the things that eventually reduces the power of the caliph, right? At the beginning, under the Rashidun Caliphate, the caliph does play this sort of central role of, kind of like interpreting what Muhammad meant by different things and offering their own thoughts. And they can do that because they knew Muhammad personally, right? So they have, they're pretty good people to answer those kind of questions. And of course, they're chosen partly because it's thought that they are, the sort of most loyal and virtuous of Muhammad's followers that remains alive. So this has a chart, a timeline that covers the earliest 6 caliphs. Sorry, I can't count, that's 7. The first 5 are the Rashidun or patriarchal caliphate, and then after that, those next 2, Muawiyah the first and Yazid the first, are the first 2 of the first Caliphate dynasty, who are the Umayyads. And it's a dynasty because Muawiyah passes on the caliphate to his son, and Yazid passes it on to his son, or maybe it's his grandson, I forget, but to his eldest surviving and competent relative. It's not a primogeniture thing. That you can sort of pick the person who seems best and set them up to be your successor, but it's someone from your family. And this emerges via a process of civil war, more or less, right? So the term that's used to talk about these periods of strife inside of the Muslim community is fitna. And there are several periods and several incidents inside of the early caliphates where there is struggle. So most of the early caliphs die violently, assassinated one way or another. And Muawiyah is involved in a struggle with the previous 2 caliphs, Ali, Abi Talib, and Hassan ibn Ali. So Hassan is Ali's son, and Ali is Muhammad's son-in-law. So he marries Muhammad's daughter Fatima, and his caliphate was marred by this struggle with Muawiyah. Muawiyah was this very powerful man who headed a very important and prestigious clan in the Arab world, and had been like a very successful general and won a lot of battles and accumulated a lot of renown fighting against the Romans. And he based himself in Syria. And he didn't really accept Ali's being raised to caliph. He wanted to be caliph himself. And Ali was able to kind of keep things under control for a few years, but eventually he was assassinated. And his son was basically intimidated / tricked into resigning. So his son Hassan, he was elevated to the caliphate, but as you can see on the chart, he was only caliph for a year, and he resigned. He stepped down and allowed Muawiyah to take over, and was partly tricked in that. And that part of the deal was that Muawiyah would not be succeeded by his son, and Hassan would become caliph once again after Muawiyah died, but that never happened. And that transition, transformed the caliphate into from this quite sort of interesting and unusual kind of like semi-elective, theocratic kind of religious / political position into something that's a lot more like a hereditary dynasty of emperors. Okay, and so Muawiyah lived a long time and was a very sort of successful ruler. He managed to really cement his family's position at the center of power in the caliphate, and partly he did that via being very successful again as a military leader. So winning battles against the enemies of the Muslims outside of their border, and his dynasty went on to rule as caliphs for more than 100 years, for a pretty long period of time. And it was under the Umayyad dynasty that the Caliphate had its largest geographical extent. And at its height, it was absolutely gargantuan. It was huge. The sort of one thing that the Umayyads were never successful in doing was actually finally conquering Constantinople. It was, the most difficult city in the world to capture, really. It had enormous walls. It was in a very advantageous geographical position. It had, this naval presence that protected it, and they tried, but the Muslims were not able to conquer it for another, 800 years, until gunpowder and cannons were invented, and they could finally knock down its walls with enormous cannonballs. And I mean, one of the interesting things is that they came relatively close, and if they had conquered Constantinople, it's interesting to think how different the subsequent history of Europe would have been, because it's not clear exactly how far their power might have extended beyond Constantinople without that sort of standing firm in their way. Certainly they would have conquered Greece and the Balkans, and who knows, it might have gone as far as England, for all we know, to kind of riff off of a famous historian, Gibbon, who was talking about a different battle that the Muslims did not win. And so the emergence of the Caliphate was this incredibly transformative, important event in world history, really, but I mean especially in the history of Eurasia and Europe and the West and all those things. What happens is you get this enormously powerful new empire that is based around this new religion, and it transforms the culture of the areas that it controls, and well beyond its borders as well. Right? Islam spreads within its borders via conversion, and there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, one of the central reasons really is just that Islam is a very appealing religion, right? People convert to it quite willingly. It's still growing today. People convert to Islam, but at the time, right? People converted to Islam both because it was appealing in itself, but also the way that the rules were set up in the Caliphate. Non-Muslims were second-class citizens, right? They were tolerated; they're allowed to practice their religion, but they had to pay a special tax called the jizya, and there were various other social restrictions, right? So they might not be able to sit in a place that's above a Muslim, or they were banned from riding horses and things like that, and they couldn't worship in public. So there were various restrictions, and so that was also an encouragement for people to convert, right? And so over time, the percentage of the population that was Muslim inside of the Caliphate grew and grew and grew, but also beyond its borders as well. So not directly by conquest, but just by it would typically be the top down, like a ruler in a particular place would convert to Islam, and that would lead to the citizens or inhabitants of that city or that area or that state converting to Islam, many or all of them as well. Okay? And so this is what created this sort of enormous unified area that I was talking about earlier, the Islamic world, right, which spread from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific, and had communities in every city of any major size, and provided this kind of a new sort of Eurasian culture that, of course, it varied from place to place, but also shared these commonalities, right? Religious practices and also legal practices, very importantly. And so over the next, number of weeks in subsequent lectures and videos and sources, we're going to explore the impact of that in various kinds of ways. But this at least sort of sets up the situation as it existed, right? And one of the things that was sort of specific to the Umayyads, but changed as Islam and the Caliphate developed, was that for the Umayyads, it was still very much, it was Muslim, but it was also Arab, right? The Arab Muslims were treated differently from the non-Arab Muslims, and it was very much kind of like, it's this clan that is in charge of the Caliphate, right? The Umayyad clan is in charge, and everything is very kind of like family-based and very power-based. And that would change with the next dynasty, the Abbasids, who I'm not going to talk about in any detail today, but who are very intimately tied in with Persian culture, Persian and Arab, and who really sort of spearhead this transformation into the Caliphate as being kind of a community of all Muslims, right? That also incorporates many non-Muslim groups peacefully within its borders. Okay, so that'll wrap up this video, and with it our discussion of the transition from classical to medieval. I hope you found it interesting.